Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Facebook Live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific.
And a warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers watching us live here in Washington. Today we are once again taking your questions, and I'm glad to say that Shaka is right here ready to take your questions. So let's start. There are so many things happening all over the world, but I think it's important that we start in France. Emmanuel Macron's party seems to be doing very, very well. They almost swept the primaries. Let's see how they do in maybe 2 weeks' time.
No, in 1 week's time, as a matter of fact, because the French Legislative Assembly, they normally go through two rounds. But there's no question that when you look at what occurred on Sunday, that you are probably looking at the end of what we had come to know as the Fifth Republic, which had been started back in 1958 by this tall giant, General Charles de Gaulle. 1958, my friend.
Interesting. There's something fascinating about French politics. And maybe is it the people behind the politics? Is it because they have a new blood, a new sheriff in town, somebody who seems to be young, energetic, even though some of his critics say that he went for his wife is maybe a little bit older than him, but that shouldn't matter really.
One of the giants that inspired me really to become a journalist is a man called George Padmore, the author of, among other things, Pan-Africanism or Communism. And in that book, he talks about, for example, the different types of European colonialism. And when it comes to the French colonialism, he talks about it as being logical, especially because for them, they did not think that you were different from them, rather than that for them they thought their culture was superior than yours. So basically all they wanted to do now is to kind of like interact with you, teach you, and eventually you sort of assimilate and became a civilized, at least in their words, a French gentleman or a French lady. So he said their colonialism he thought was logical, and there are a lot of studies, in fact, which suggest that the French have historically been very philosophical, very intellectual. And so when you think about it, they are probably carrying out in this modern day a sort of revolution through the ballot box rather than the bullet, even though, of course, at one time they used the bullet, especially through those days after the French Revolution, and we're talking about people like Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte.
In fact, you remind me of something when I was younger, studying the French Revolution and European colonization of, especially the partition of Africa. I'm reminded of the fact of how, the French opted for assimilation or assimilado, and the British or the other people opted for colonialism, which is very, very different style. But when you look at the French some of the French colonies, especially in West Africa, they had totally different experiences as opposed to the Brits, people who are colonized by the British. For us, I will speak for where I come from, like in Uganda, the British did not pretend that they liked us.
No.
Or they wanted us to be close to them.
That's why they introduced, for example, either indirect rule, meaning governing you by proxy through your own traditional leaders, or in some cases like Kenya, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Zambia, and then South Africa and other places. That's why they decided these were settler colonies. These were territories which were never to be politically independent under the indigenous African people. Now, the French, of course, did not simply talk the talk, because they went on to sort of demonstrate in practice. Because the last time I checked, the founding father of what became the Ivory Coast was a man called Houphouët-Boigny. And Houphouët-Boigny, you can't believe, he was a minister of state in Paris. The man who was the founding president of Senegal, Senghor. The man was the chief grammarian of the French parliament. This is during colonialism, my friend.
There is something about that, but let's go back to Emmanuel Macron's party. This is unknown. He just really became a president of France out of nowhere. Nobody expected him to be where he is. It seems like right now everybody is gravitating towards his party. What makes him tick?
The guy is probably a genius, frankly. Let's face it, he's only 39, except that he also marries, of course, a wife who happens to be 24 years older than him. They first met when he was 15. And his wife used to be his
so is that a plus?
Drama teacher. Obviously, it has turned out to be a plus. There's no question that he seemed to have taken some of the lessons very well. Look, this is a man who also becomes a minister of the economy under the former socialist president, Francois Hollande. This is a man, as you say correctly, who started a sort of movement, not even a party, a movement, about a year ago. And as you say again, nobody frankly expected him to be reflected on the political radar, really. And he ends up, of course, winning the first round, even though he had about 24% of the vote. He ended up being the top. And in the runoff, of course, he was also very lucky because of being politically in the middle. A lot of French people who actually voted for him, it is not because they were voting for him, but rather they had to vote against his opponent, Marine Le Pen, who happens to be essentially what they would call an extremist right-wing sort of politician. This is a man who some pundits thought he may find it very difficult to govern because they did not expect him, for example, eventually to be able to win a majority in the French House of Deputies. It is made up of about 577. And from what I am seeing, my brother, this man may in fact end up either equaling the record of General Charles de Gaulle, who in 1968 won 80% of the House of Legislators in France. This man, if he doesn't do that, at least he will get like 3/4. And what does that mean? It means, of course, he can govern almost in any way he wants because he will have a very, very comfortable majority. And some of these people who actually won elections by associating with him did not have, like him, any political experience. These were very young, beneficiaries perhaps of the new method of communication, the almighty social media. So we are actually looking at the power of the social media.
A young guy from Rwanda who was in France who actually won his primary. He might become one of the first few Africans member of parliament in that French parliament.
Yeah, obviously he will not be breaking any record because there have been some Africans that in fact have been part of either the House of Deputies or even in fact members of the cabinet for that matter. But it's very significant that these guys who are very young, political novices, end up winning these very important elections. And also, again, it comes out to say, by the way, that when people talk about the combination of the changing demographics and the proliferation of social media, that this could actually change the world. It seems to me that it is changing France right now.
Well, there is a saying that all politics is local, so let's maybe shift the conversation to Washington, D.C. here.
Correct.
There is a lot of stuff happening, especially all the heads of the Justice Department here testifying on Capitol Hill. Attorney General Jeff Sessions is being questioned as we speak. His deputy appeared earlier. They all seem to be talking about the Russia. What's going on?
the Russia that you call the Russia is probably the political elephant in the room. Mind you, this goes to show that this country, contrary to what some international pundits have been saying about the viability of the system of government of the United States, in fact, it goes to show that you are talking about a country that prides itself on the strength of its institutions as opposed to strong men, just like where you and I come from. So we are basically looking at a system of government play out. This is a sort of semblance of a mature democracy, even though I will be one of the first to admit that democracy, of course, is always a work in progress. But this is what we are seeing here, reminding us that perhaps a Civil War key president, Abraham Lincoln, may have actually been right on the money when he described or characterized democracy as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of some individuals, by some individuals, for some individuals.
Some critics have said that this Russian investigation is derailing Trump's agenda. Do you agree?
There's no question about it. I mean, how can he possibly focus? The question, the problem is that he probably ended up actually with the wrong type of, person that he had to interact with or he had to praise or whatever, because let's face it, historically, even though during the Second World War, Russia, what you call Russia, at that time was called the Soviet Union, used to be an ally of the United States, Britain, and some part of France, which ended up winning the war. But guess what? After winning the war, they immediately became adversaries to such an extent that we have a period that we refer to as the Cold War. And for the most part, when we talk about the Cold War, we talk about, frankly, the rivalry between Washington, D.C. and Moscow.
Let's go to our social media comments, and I think let's start from your hometown of Kabale. Julius Muchungzi from Uganda asks, Mr. Shaka, could you tell me your legacy of which people of Kigezi will live to remember you?
Very interesting. That sounds like a very, very familiar name. Julius Muchungzi. I hope that he is, or he is probably not the one that I first met in 1995 at a place that also used to be my alma mater, Kigezi High School. A man who thought that I had inspired him, that I had encouraged him to be the best that he could be. And if it is him again, Julius Muchungzi, I know that he has actually written a book, something about the story of keeping hope alive. So if that is the one, he probably happens to happen to be one of the building blocks of what would be called Ndugu Shaka, or the Kabale Kids legacy. Not that I believe in legacy so much, to tell you the truth. I don't spend my time thinking about what is my legacy. But I'm reminded, by the way, that all of life is about action and passion. And to ignore the actions and passion of your lifetime or your generation is to risk having not lived, and having not really lived at all. That would obviously mean that you end up occupying space. I don't think that for what I have actually done or not done, there is anybody, frankly, in their right senses, perhaps, that would end up saying my legacy would be equal to having occupied space. I have spoken truth to power. I have provoked. I have tried to make the powers that be accountable for their actions. And so for that, probably, I might end up, in fact, being identified as a fairly good advocate of social economic justice for all of us.
Speaking of economic justice, let's go to Makata Thor Ariel. Do current African leaders represent the symbol of progress on the continent, or working for their own children and grandchildren? If our former liberators like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Julius Nyerere came back today, what would they say?
It is very interesting that Makta could actually say that, because only last week we had an edition of Straight Talk Africa, which was looking at the Africa that we want. And some of the key names that we were talking about, who probably can always really be looked at as giants, as treasures of what we call Africa, include the Wasajefo, Ghanaian founding leader, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. It included, of course, people like Julius Kambarage Nyerere, the Tanzanian founding leader, or you could even say that founding leader for what was called Tanganyika, a man that helped really liberate a lot of Southern African, colonized states. We're talking about Mozambique, a former Lussophonic country. We're talking about what was then called Rhodesia, and especially Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. We're talking about the end and independence of Azania. Some people call it Azania, which is South Africa. You're talking about a man called Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And when you talk about Kwame Nkrumah, you're talking about perhaps the single most visionary leader that Africa has yet had. A man like Nkrumah, he gets independence on March 6, 1957. A man who comes from Crawford, a very small village, Paul, by the way, because I have been there with his daughter Samia. When you look at that place, you would have thought, frankly, that this guy would have been preoccupied with trying to build like a mansion, trying to build a skyscraper, so that people can say, look, this man is a son of the soil. Instead, this man was actually looking at Africa as his home, to such an extent that he actually made a huge statement when his country, the Gold Coast, regained political independence. He said the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of the rest of Africa. He did not talk the talk only. He did walk, in fact, that talk by providing the necessary tools so that Africans eventually would actually walk the walk. So we're talking about some very, very interesting individuals here who probably don't have many peers, really. When we talk about Jomo Kenyatta, he was also their brother, in fact, senior in terms of age. And when he came to Kenya, he was really being seen as a hero. And he was in many ways, to such an extent that, for example, he was the father of a major opposition leader in Kenyan politics, Raila Amolo Odinga. His father was called Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. And we used to read Drum magazine when we were kids at that time, and we would be looking at this man wearing shorts, wearing a Muslim cap, and wearing some very interesting shoes, which were very simple, perhaps made out of some very basic car tires or something like that. Yeah. This man had been given an opportunity. He
was the father of the current president, Uhuru Kenyatta.
No. This was Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. Okay. And the man was given an opportunity by the British colonialists to be the founding prime minister of independent Kenya. He said, you know what? I am not going to go there. You are going to have to release our leaders. By that he meant Jomo Kenyatta, who happens to be the father of the current or incumbent Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta. Now, Uhuru Kenyatta was a great symbol. There is no question about that. He had a remarkable voice, very articulate. He had credentials from the London School of Economics. But when it came to the politics of the stomach, I am afraid that a lot of critics are on his case, because he seemed, frankly, for the most part, to have been very patriotic to his stomach, patriotic to the stomach of his family and friends, not the entire nation.
Yeah, on that list, I was going to say that you could add Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, Abdullah Nasser.
Kenneth Kaunda was
Milton Obote in
yes,
Uganda.
Kenneth Kaunda was a terrific guy, even when he lost an election in 1991 after 27 years at the political harem of his country. You can't believe he had no personal house. He had no personal things. The man was a servant of the people, a servant of the state. Then we talk about Colonel Gamara Abdel Nasser, a man who came to essentially overthrow King Farouk in 1952 and appointed a General Nagibo to be the military head of state for a year, and then marched in and became one of those architects, really, of what we know today as the African Union, by being one of the first people, along with who you announced earlier, Milton Obote of Uganda, or Apollo Milton Obote, people like Kwame Nkrumah, the great emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and people like Sekou Toure, and there were a lot of other people who actually decided on May 25th, 1963, to enter into an agreement that established what was called the Organization of African Unity, and eventually, of course, the African Union.
Interesting. Let's go to an interesting comment here from Kisala Samuel. Why is it that the so-called new breed of African leaders have turned into dictators? And of course, I'm sure he's referring to a comment attributed to President Clinton when he mentioned Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. At the time, there was Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, and Rwandan President Paul Kagame.
In fact, even briefly, they added Laurent Desire Kabila of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think part of the problem, frankly, was that people like U.S. President Bill Clinton, with his very close aides, then Dr. Susan Rice, who I believe was either at the White House or at the National Security Council, or at the time, in fact, had become the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. I think they misread the whole thing, or probably whenever they would meet with some of these individuals, they will probably find some similarities in the sense that both had read probably Shakespeare, Hadley Chase, maybe, these kinds of literary giants, that both had read in high school and what have you, and so they clearly thought that they were looking at a new breed of African leaders who were remarkably articulate, who they felt that they could do business together. It is also quite possible that they basically were simply playing with words, because there are people who have said that these people, it's not frankly that they were ever non-dictators. These people were essentially dictators, and therefore should in fact have been characterized, perhaps, these are their words, not mine, a new breed of African dictators, rather than a new breed of African leaders, because they argued these would be eventually, or become eventually, the beacons of hope for African democracy. But from what you have said, you could help me to answer this question. You go back to Asmara, Isaias Afwerki. Come a little down to Addis Ababa, Meles Zenawi. Go to Kampala, the Ugandan capital, Yoweri Museveni. Go to Kigali, Paul Kagame. And in fact, you could end up going again to DRC, even though between those, them and Kabila fell out immediately. And they even helped, in fact, some of their friends in Rwanda and Uganda and Burundi to figure out a way of, you know, kicking them out of office. So if you can answer that question for me, have you seen any semblance of democracy between Asmara and Kigali?
Well, there seems to be no difference, but on the particular question, I will not comment.
I see.
Okay, so let's move on to Emmanuel Smoky. Why do most African leaders preach what they cannot do?
Well, that obviously is a very subjective question, because I think that there are some African leaders who probably preach water and drink water. But I think I would agree with him that there are situations where a lot of African leaders preach water and drink red wine.
Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. Let's go to Kula Masenda from Zambia. Mr. Shaka, does sovereignty allow persecution of citizens, especially perceived political opponents?
Well, first of all, I think I should in fact conclude what I just said about people who preach water and end up drinking red wine. Because the question, frankly, was why? I think perhaps these are people, frankly, who do not believe in anything other than their stomachs. The stomachs of their families and friends, and certainly not the stomachs of their communities or societies, because if they did, mind you, these have incredible power. They have incredible opportunity to deliver goods, and yet when you go to those types of countries, there is the absence of service delivery. There is the absence of people having access to medical care, good schooling, and what have you. But when you talk about the other question that you said was about what?
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty is, by the way, I think mischaracterized there, because sovereignty, in fact, means people. If there is sovereignty, it has to be a reflection of the people, because it is the people who are supposed to have power. But that can only happen, my brother, in a society that has policies and is governed in a manner that reflects social, economic justice for
all. Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are going to look at women empowerment. We're going to look at the obstacles that women face, the opportunities also that are available to them. That is pretty much what we are going to be talking about, because sometimes I frankly don't understand why there are people that look in terms of gender differences when society should actually be doing things that reflect the reality of our societies, meaning the mother and the father, the sister and the brother. So that's how we are going to be looking at it, my friend. We're going to be talking about how daughters and sons should be on the same page.
Very briefly, what could South Sudanese learn from this whole experience? They have had a series of situations where we don't know what's happening in South Sudan.
I think part of the problem, frankly, are some of these regional groups which have the power to make a difference. They don't seem to be doing it, perhaps because of selfish reasons or selfish interests. I think people and leaders in South Sudan need to come out and see